The echo of gunfire rattled through the sage-strewn valley as Nora Nelson clutched her 3-month-old daughter to her chest, the baby's cries muffled against the rough cotton of her dress. It was 1877 in the unforgiving territory of Wyoming, and the small town of Centralia had just witnessed the kind of violence that turned ordinary folk into legends. "Hand over the child, madam, and nobody else gets hurt," drawled the tall outlaw, his face half hidden beneath a dusty bandana, eyes cold as Winter Creek water. 2 more men flanked him, their horses pawing nervously at the dirt road leading out of town. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs as she backed away, her boots catching on the rough-hewn boardwalk. 6 months a widow, she had nothing left but little Emma, and these monsters wanted to take her only reason for living. "I'd rather die," she spat, turning to run, but the outlaw's gloved hand caught her arm in a vise-like grip. "That can be arranged," he whispered, his breath reeking of whiskey and chewing tobacco. The sound of a revolver being cocked broke the tense silence. "I suggest you reconsider your plans, gentlemen." The voice was deep, steady as bedrock, and it belonged to Mason O'Malley, the newest arrival to Centralia. He stood 20 paces away, his stance wide and confident, Colt peacemaker aimed with the kind of precision that made even hardened outlaws think twice. "This ain't your fight, cowboy," snarled the outlaw leader, but his grip on Nora loosened just enough for her to pull away. Mason's blue eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his Stetson. "You made it my fight when you threatened a woman and her child on my watch." What happened next would forever change the quiet valley town of Centralia, Wyoming territory. It would bind together the lives of a desperate young mother and a mysterious cowboy with shadows in his eyes darker than a moonless prairie night. The leader of the Outlaws, a man known in whispered conversations as Rattlesnake Riley, flexed his fingers above his holstered weapon. "You're outnumbered, stranger." "Maybe so," Mason replied, his voice calm as still water, "but I only need 1 bullet to make your companions reconsider their loyalties." Nora clutched Emma tighter, the baby now eerily silent as if sensing the deadly standoff. In the distance, the town church bell tolled 3 times, marking mid-afternoon in a day that stretched like eternity. "We came for the baby," Rattlesnake said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "Price on her head's good enough to retire on." Mason's expression didn't change, but Nora felt a chill race down her spine. "A price on Emma, her innocent daughter." "There's no price that justifies stealing a child from her mother," Mason replied. "Now you boys have until I count to 3 to mount up and ride out of Centralia, or I promise you'll never ride anywhere again." Rattlesnake's hand twitched, and in that heartbeat of a moment, fate dealt its cards. Mason's gun barked once, twice, 3 times with deadly accuracy. The valley echoed with the reports, and then fell into a silence so profound, it seemed the entire world had stopped breathing. 3 outlaws lay motionless in the street, their blood seeping into the thirsty Wyoming dust. Mason holstered his weapon with practiced efficiency, then crossed to where Nora stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice gentler now. "No," she whispered, then with growing urgency, "but they wanted Emma. They said there was a price on her head." "Why would anyone want my baby?" Mason's weather-beaten face creased with concern. "I don't know, but I aim to find out." He touched the brim of his hat. "Mason O'Malley, at your service." "Nora Nelson," she replied automatically, then added, "and this is Emma." The baby, as if recognizing her name, let out a soft coo and blinked up at the tall cowboy with curious eyes. "Pleased to meet you both," Mason said with the hint of a smile, "though I wish it were under better circumstances." Sheriff Walter Haynes arrived then, huffing from the exertion of his run from the jailhouse 2 blocks away. "Dear Lord," he exclaimed, surveying the scene. "O'Malley, what in tarnation happened here?" As Mason explained, Nora noticed how he kept himself positioned between her and the gathering crowd, his broad shoulders a shield against the curious and horrified stares of Centralia's citizens. "Mrs. Nelson, you and the baby should come to my office," Sheriff Haynes said when Mason finished. "We need to sort this out." "I'll escort them," Mason said, and it wasn't a request. The sheriff's office was a simple clapboard building with a single cell visible through iron bars. Nora sat in a straight-backed chair, Emma now sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, while Mason leaned against the wall, his eyes constantly moving between the window and the door. "Now then," Sheriff Haynes said, settling behind his desk. "Why would outlaws be after your child, Mrs. Nelson?" Nora shook her head. "I don't know, it doesn't make sense. Emma is just a baby." "Your husband," the sheriff began delicately, "might he have had enemies?" "Thomas was a schoolteacher," Nora replied. "He died of fever 6 months ago before Emma was born. He was well liked by everyone." Mason shifted his weight. "Sheriff, I've heard rumors of baby stealing rings operating out west, wealthy families back east paying for infants when they can't have their own." The sheriff's bushy eyebrows rose. "That's mighty dark business, O'Malley." "It is," Mason agreed. "And it's not the only possibility. Could be these men were hired by someone specific." Nora felt sick at the thought. Who would do such a thing? "That's what we need to find out," Mason said. "But first we need to make sure you and Emma are safe." The sheriff rubbed his graying whiskers. "Mrs. Nelson's been staying at the boarding house since her husband passed. Not the most secure location." "I have a small ranch just outside town," Mason offered. "It's defensible, remote enough to see visitors coming, but close enough if we need help." Sheriff Haynes nodded slowly. "Might be the best option for now." He turned to Nora. "Mrs. Nelson, I know Mr. O'Malley hasn't been in Centralia long, but he's proven himself a man of character. I'd trust him with my own kin if needed." Nora looked at Mason, really looked at him for the first time. He was tall, with shoulders broadened by years of hard work. His face was tanned by the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into the distance. There was something in those eyes, a pain, a history that resonated with her own. "Why would you help us?" she asked directly. "You don't know us." Mason met her gaze steadily. "Some things are just plain wrong, madam. Men threatening a mother and child is one of them. Besides," he added with a slight softening of his expression, "I've got plenty of room and it's mighty quiet out there." An hour later, with a few hastily packed belongings, Nora found herself riding beside Mason in his wagon, Emma secure in a makeshift sling across her chest. The bodies of the outlaws had been moved to the undertakers, and Sheriff Haynes had promised to telegraph neighboring towns for information. "It's about 4 miles, Mason explained as they left Centralia behind. "Good grazing land, a stream that doesn't run dry even in summer." "You've been here long?" Nora asked. 8 months, he replied. "Bought the place from a widower heading back east to live with his daughter." "And before that," Mason's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. "Texas, mostly, did some scouting for the army, drove cattle, the usual." There was more to his story, Nora sensed, but didn't press. Everyone in the West had a past they might prefer to leave undisturbed, like a rattlesnake under a rock. The ranch came into view as they crested a small rise, a modest but well-built cabin with a barn and corral. A few head of cattle grazed in the distance, and a vegetable garden showed signs of careful tending. "It's lovely," Nora said, meaning it. The setting sun painted the scene in gold and amber, casting long shadows across land that seemed to stretch forever. "It's nothing fancy," Mason replied, but she caught the pride in his voice. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with chairs, and basic cooking equipment. A door led to what was clearly Mason's bedroom, and another to a smaller room he explained had been used for storage. "You and Emma can take my room," he said. "I'll clear out the small room tomorrow, make it proper for the baby, but for now you'll both be comfortable in there." "I can't take your bedroom," Nora protested. "You can and you will," Mason said firmly. "I've slept under the stars more nights than I can count. A bedroll by the fire is a luxury compared to some places I've rested my head." As night fell, Mason cooked a simple but satisfying meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread. Emma, fed and changed, slept in a drawer lined with soft blankets and improvised cradle Mason had quickly arranged. "You're good with her," Nora observed as Mason gently tucked the blanket around the sleeping infant. He straightened, something flickering across his face too quickly to read. "Had some practice. My sister had 3 little ones before." He stopped, turning away to tend the fire. Before Nora prompted gently, Mason's shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. Cholera, 5 years ago, took my sister, her husband, and their youngest. The other two boys are with my aunt in St. Louis now. I'm so sorry, Nora said, understanding the weight of such loss all too well. He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without turning. It's getting late, you should rest. Tomorrow we'll need to figure out why those men were after Emma. Nora lay awake in Mason's bed, surrounded by the subtle scent of him leather, pine soap, and something indefinably male. Emma breathed softly in her makeshift crib, and outside an owl called into the night. Despite the comfort of the bed, sleep eluded her as questions tumbled through her mind. Why would anyone target her baby? Thomas had been a simple schoolteacher, beloved by his students and respected in Centralia. They had no wealth, no enemies that she knew of. Yet 3 men had died today trying to take her daughter. Morning came with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee. Mason had already been up for hours, she realized, hearing him moving quietly around the main room. Sleep well. He asked when she emerged, Emma in her arms. As well as could be expected, Nora replied honestly. She noticed he'd shaved and changed his shirt and was frying eggs and potatoes in a cast iron skillet. I've been thinking, Mason said, sliding a plate in front of her as she sat at the table. Those men knew exactly who they were looking for. This wasn't random. Nora bounced Emma gently as the baby began to fuss. I've been thinking the same, but I can't imagine why. Tell me about your husband, Mason said, sitting across from her with his own plate. Where was he from originally? Pennsylvania, Nora answered. He came west after the war, looking for a fresh start like so many others. We met in Denver, married there, then moved to Centralia when the school needed a teacher. Any family? His parents died when he was young. He was raised by an uncle who passed before we met. Mason nodded slowly, taking in the information. And your family? My father was a doctor in St. Louis. Mother died when I was 16. Father remarried 2 years later a younger woman named Catherine who never particularly warmed to me. Nora sighed. When I met Thomas, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to start fresh. Your father's still in St. Louis. He passed 3 years ago. Catherine inherited everything. Mason's brow furrowed. So neither of you had close family ties or obvious enemies. No, Nora agreed. We were just ordinary people trying to build a quiet life. After breakfast, Mason rode into town to check with Sheriff Haynes while Nora stayed at the ranch, doors locked and a loaded shotgun within reach as per Mason's instructions. By mid-afternoon, Emma was napping and Nora had mended 2 of Mason's shirts she'd found with torn seams. The sound of approaching hooves sent her heart racing, but relief washed over her when she recognized Mason's broad-shouldered silhouette through the window. Any news? She asked as he came through the door. Some, he said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg. Sheriff got responses to his telegrams. The men were part of a gang run by someone called Fletcher Blackwood. Mean piece of work with a reputation for taking any job if the price is right. So they were hired to take Emma, Nora said, her suspicion confirmed. Seems that way. Mason pulled a folded paper from his pocket. Sheriff also found this in one of their saddlebags. Nora took the paper, opening it with trembling fingers. It was a letter written in an elegant hand. The child is to be delivered unharmed. Payment as agreed upon delivery to the designated location. Further instructions will follow successful acquisition. Failure is not an option. It was unsigned. Whoever wrote this has money and education, Mason observed, not your typical outlaw employer. But why Emma? What makes her valuable to someone like that? Mason sat heavily in a chair. That's what we need to figure out. Is there anything unusual about Emma's birth? Anything at all? Nora shook her head, then paused. Well, there was one thing, but it couldn't possibly matter. Dr. Winters, who delivered Emma, mentioned she had a small birthmark shaped like a crescent moon behind her left ear. He said it was good luck. Mason leaned forward. May I see it? Carefully, Nora tilted the sleeping Emma to reveal the tiny mark, barely visible against her fair skin. Mason stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I've seen a mark like this before, he said finally. On a woman in Texas, she was. He hesitated. She was from a very wealthy family, said the mark had appeared in her family for generations. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. What are you suggesting? I'm not sure yet, Mason admitted, but this might be about lineage inheritance. Is there any chance Thomas wasn't who he said he was? No, Nora said firmly, then less certainly. At least, I don't think so. He was just Thomas Nelson, a schoolteacher with a gentle heart and dreams of a family. Mason nodded, respecting her defense of her late husband. I'm not doubting your word, Nora, but sometimes people keep secrets even from those they love most. What do we do now? She asked, cradling Emma closer. We need to know more about Thomas's background, and we need to be prepared for more of Blackwood's men. They won't give up after one failure, not with money involved. That night, as they sat before the fire after Emma had been put to bed, Nora found herself watching Mason as he cleaned his revolver with practiced efficiency. His hands were strong but moved with surprising gentleness, the same hands that had killed 3 men to protect her and Emma, that had tenderly tucked blankets around her baby. Have you killed many men? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Mason's hands stilled briefly before resuming their work. More than I care to remember, he said quietly. During the war and after, never without cause, but that doesn't make it any easier to live with. Yet you didn't hesitate yesterday. Some decisions don't leave room for hesitation. He reassembled the weapon with quick, precise movements. When a child's life is at stake, there's no choice to be made. Thank you, Nora said, for what you did, for taking us in. Mason looked up, meeting her eyes. Anyone would have done the same. No, she disagreed softly. They wouldn't. Most men would have looked the other way, not wanting trouble. A log shifted in the fire, sending sparks dancing upward. In the flickering light, Nora could see the weariness in Mason's face, the weight of experiences she could only imagine. What brought you to Centralia, Mason, really? He set the revolver aside, considering his words. I was looking for a place where the past couldn't find me, somewhere quiet to start over. A humorless smile touched his lips. Seems I found trouble anyway. I'm sorry we brought danger to your door. Don't be, he said firmly. Some things are worth facing danger for. The way he looked at her then made Nora's breath catch, and she wondered if he was still talking only about Emma. 3 days passed in a rhythm of cautious vigilance. Mason taught Nora how to shoot his spare revolver properly, correcting her stance and grip with touches that lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary. They took turns watching for riders approaching the property, though none came. In the evenings, they talked about books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they'd had before life taught them to dream smaller. On the 4th morning, Sheriff Haynes rode out to the ranch with news. Got a reply from a detective agency in Philadelphia I contacted, he said, accepting a cup of coffee at Mason's table. Seems there was a Thomas Nelson who attended university there, but he died in '71 of typhoid, never went west. Nora felt the room tilt slightly. That can't be right. Thomas was very much alive until last year. The detective is looking into it further, the sheriff continued. Also, there's been word of riders asking questions in towns around here, describing a woman with a baby matching your description. Mason's jaw tightened. Blackwood's men, likely. I've deputized a few reliable men to keep watch, but Centralia isn't exactly Fort Laramie. We've got limited manpower. We should leave, Mason said decisively. Head somewhere they wouldn't expect, buy time to figure out who's behind this. Sheriff Haynes nodded. Not a bad idea. I can provide an escort to the train station in Laramie. No trains, Mason countered. Too easy to track. We'll go by wagon, but not toward any major settlement. He looked at Nora. I know some remote places in the mountains where we could stay hidden for weeks if needed. Nora glanced down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware of the danger surrounding her. I'll go wherever keeps her safe. After the sheriff left, promising to continue investigating, Mason and Nora began preparations for departure. They would leave at first light, taking only what they could carry in the wagon without slowing them down. That night, as they packed supplies, Nora found herself pausing over a photograph of Thomas, the only one she possessed. The face that had once been so dear to her now seemed like that of a stranger. Had she ever really known him, having doubts? Mason asked, noticing her contemplation. I thought we had an honest marriage, Nora said softly. Now I wonder if everything was a lie. Mason set down the ammunition he was organizing and came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Not everything," he said. "Emma is real. Your love for her is real." He hesitated before adding, "And whatever his secrets, I believe Thomas loved you. A man doesn't build a life with a woman like you unless his feelings are genuine." Nora looked up at him, touched by his certainty. "A woman like me," something shifted in Mason's expression, a vulnerability he quickly masked. "Strong, kind. The sort who mends a stranger's shirts without being asked and faces down outlaws to protect her child." Their eyes held for a long moment, the air between them charged with something neither was ready to name. Then Emma stirred and broke the spell, and they returned to their preparations with renewed purpose. They left before dawn, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten as Mason's wagon rolled away from the ranch. Nora sat beside him with Emma secured in a sling across her chest, a rifle across her lap. They had enough supplies for 2 weeks, and Mason had mapped a route that would keep them away from main trails. "The mountains will be cooler," Mason warned as the sun rose fully, illuminating the distant peaks they were heading toward. "But there's a cabin I know of used by trappers in winter. It should be empty this time of year." "How do you know about these places?" Nora asked. Mason's eyes scanned the horizon continuously as he drove. "After the war, I wasn't fit for civilized company. Spent years in the wild places, trapping, hunting, guiding when someone needed it. You learn where the shelters are when your life depends on it." They traveled steadily through the day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and tend to Emma's needs. By late afternoon, they had entered the foothills, the terrain growing steadily more rugged. "We'll make camp here," Mason decided as they reached a small clearing beside a stream. "It's sheltered, with good visibility of the approach." As they set up camp, the domesticity of their actions struck Nora as strangely intimate. Mason building a fire while she prepared a simple meal, Emma contentedly watching the play of light through the leaves above them. If circumstances had been different, they might have been any young family enjoying an outing in the wilderness. The thought brought an unexpected pang. Thomas had been gone for nearly a year now, and while she had mourned him deeply, she realized that she had been lonely for far longer. Even before his death, there had been a distance between them that she had attributed to the stresses of his work and her pregnancy. "Penny for your thoughts," Mason said, returning from tending the horses. "Just wondering what our next move will be if we make it to this cabin," Nora replied, deflecting from her true musings. "When we make it," Mason corrected her, "and then we wait for the sheriff's investigation to bear fruit or for Blackwood's men to give up. Do men like that ever give up?" Mason added another stick to the fire. "Eventually, when the cost outweighs the reward." They ate in companionable silence as darkness fell, the fire casting dancing shadows across their faces. Emma had fallen asleep, and Nora gently transferred her to a nest of blankets in the wagon. "I'll take first watch," Mason said. "You should rest while you can." "Wake me for the second shift," Nora insisted. "You need sleep too." Mason looked as if he might argue, then nodded. 4 hours, then." Nora settled into her bedroll near the fire, watching as Mason positioned himself on a fallen log, rifle across his knees, his profile sharp against the night sky. Despite the circumstances, she felt strangely safer than she had felt in months, perhaps years. She was drifting toward sleep when a twig snapped in the darkness beyond their camp. Mason was on his feet instantly, rifle raised, every line of his body tense with alertness. "Get to the wagon," he whispered. "Stay low." Heart pounding, Nora crawled to the wagon where Emma slept, pulling her revolver from its holster. Through a gap in the canvas cover, she watched as Mason moved silently toward the source of the sound. The night exploded with gunfire. A bullet splintered wood near Nora's head, and she ducked, covering Emma with her body as the baby woke with a startled cry. More shots rang out, and she heard Mason return fire, his voice calling out in the darkness. "Nora, take the reins and go, now." Desperation lending her strength, Nora scrambled into the driver's seat, Emma clutched against her with one arm. She slapped the reins against the horses' backs, and the wagon lurched forward. "Mason," she called back, unable to see him in the chaos. "Keep going." his voice answered. "I'll find you." The wagon bounced violently as the horses broke into a gallop, following the trail deeper into the forest. Nora could barely see in the darkness, relying on the animal's instincts to stay on the path. Behind her, gunfire continued, then gradually faded with distance. For what seemed like hours, Nora drove blindly forward, soothing Emma's frightened cries as best she could while keeping the horses moving. Eventually, the trail widened, and she felt confident enough to slow their pace, fearful of overturning on the rough terrain. As dawn broke, Nora found herself in an unfamiliar mountain valley with no sign of pursuit but also no sign of Mason. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, but Emma's needs came first. She stopped near a stream, tended to the baby and the horses, and tried to decide what to do next. Mason had described the cabin's location 2 days' journey into the mountains, near a waterfall where 3 peaks were visible to the north. But could she find it alone? And what had happened to Mason? The rational part of her mind suggested he might be dead, shot down by Blackwood's men while covering her escape. But something deeper, more instinctual, rejected that possibility. Mason O'Malley was not a man easily killed. Decision made, Nora consulted the rough map Mason had sketched and continued on, determined to reach the cabin. If Mason was alive, that's where he would look for her. The day passed in tense vigilance, every sound in the forest making her reach for the revolver. Emma, perhaps sensing her mother's anxiety, was uncharacteristically quiet, her wide blue eyes taking in the passing wilderness. By late afternoon, Nora caught sight of 3 distinctive peaks to the north, just as Mason had described. Hope renewed her energy as she guided the wagon toward what should be the location of the cabin. When she finally spotted the small structure nestled among pines near a tumbling waterfall, tears of relief sprang to her eyes. The cabin was simple but solid, with a stone chimney and small porch. Inside, it contained basic furnishings: a table, chairs, a stone fireplace, and a narrow bed. Dust covered everything, but it was dry and defensible, with windows facing each direction. Nora settled Emma, fed and watered the horses, and brought in essential supplies. Then she cleaned the fireplace and started a small fire, its warmth welcome as the mountain air cooled with evening. Night fell and still no Mason. Nora sat by the window, rifle ready, Emma sleeping nearby, and allowed herself to acknowledge the fear she'd been suppressing all day. Not just fear for Mason, but fear of what would happen if he didn't return. She had grown to depend on his steady presence, his quiet strength, in ways that went beyond their current crisis. The realization startled her. When had this man, a virtual stranger a week ago, become so important to her? And what did that say about her feelings for Thomas, the husband she had mourned? A noise outside snapped her from these thoughts. Raising the rifle, she moved away from the window, positioning herself where she could see the door while remaining protected. Nora. The voice was ragged but unmistakable. "Nora, it's me." "Mason." She lowered the rifle and rushed to the door, throwing it open. He stood there, leaning heavily on a makeshift walking stick, his face pale with exhaustion and pain. Blood had dried on his left sleeve and side. "You made it," he said, his relief evident despite his condition. "Emma, she's fine," Nora assured him, helping him inside. "But you're hurt." "Bullet grazed my arm, another caught my side, nothing vital," he grimaced as she helped him to a chair. "Took out 2 of them before their horses spooked. The rest gave chase, but I led them south before doubling back." "You need a doctor," Nora said, examining his wounds after helping him remove his bloodied shirt. "Just need cleaning and bandaging," Mason insisted. "I've had worse." Nora gathered water and supplies, her hands gentle as she tended his injuries. The bullet had indeed just grazed his arm, but the wound in his side, while not deep, was still bleeding sluggishly. "You could have died," she said softly as she worked. "Wasn't planning on it," Mason replied, his attempt at humor undermined by a wince as she cleaned the wound. "Not with you and Emma counting on me." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed so quickly under pressure. "Thank you," Nora said, her voice thick with emotion, "for coming back." Mason's hand covered hers where it rested on his bandaged side. "I'll always come back, Nora, as long as you want me to." The promise hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to fully explore. But it was enough for now, this understanding, this commitment to see their journey through together. Days at the cabin fell into a rhythm as Mason recovered from his wounds. They took turns keeping watch, rationing their supplies carefully and caring for Emma. In the quieter moments, they talked more openly about their pasts. Mason spoke of the war, of the horrors he'd witnessed that had driven him to seek solitude in the wilderness afterward. He told her about his sister's family, the joy and later devastation their loss had brought him. Nora shared memories of her childhood in St. Louis, her father's medical practice, and the loneliness after her mother's death and father's remarriage. She talked about meeting Thomas, his gentle courtship, and their hopes for a family. "He was so excited about the baby," Nora said one evening as they sat before the fire. "Even when he fell ill, he kept talking about all he would teach her." Mason, now able to move without wincing, watched her face in the firelight. Did he ever mention his past, family, anything unusual? Nora considered the question. He spoke little of his childhood, said it was too painful after losing his parents young. She paused, a memory surfacing. There was one strange thing, though. A few weeks before he died, he received a letter that upset him greatly. He wouldn't tell me what it contained, but he burned it immediately. And after that, he seemed afraid, started locking doors that we'd always left open. Asked me once if I would take Emma and leave Centralia if anything happened to him. She shook her head. I thought it was the fever making him paranoid. Mason leaned forward. But now I wonder if he knew something was coming, if he was trying to protect us from whatever is happening now. A week passed with no sign of pursuit. Mason's strength returned, and he began making short hunting trips to supplement their dwindling supplies. On one such excursion, he returned with not only a brace of rabbits but also news. "Ran into a trapper heading to Laramie," he reported as he cleaned his kill. "Told him I was just hunting, but asked casual like if he'd seen other travelers. Said a group of rough-looking men had been through 2 days ago, heading west. Away from us," Nora noted with relief. "For now. But they'll circle back eventually. This reprieve won't last forever." That night, after Emma was asleep, Nora found Mason on the porch, staring at the stars. She joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the mountain chill. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That we can't hide forever," he answered honestly. "Sooner or later, we need to confront whoever is behind this. How, we don't even know who they are or what they want with Emma." Mason turned to face her, his expression resolute in the moonlight. "I have an idea about that. The birthmark, it's rare, distinctive, and if I'm right about what it means, it explains everything." "What do you mean?" The woman I mentioned, with the same mark her name, was Alina Rutherford, daughter of one of the wealthiest railroad barons in the country. He paused. "She had a brother who was disinherited after a scandal. He disappeared west." Nora's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You think Thomas was Alina's brother?" "Yes, using a false name, starting a new life." "And if that's true, Emma isn't just your daughter, she's the heir to the Rutherford fortune." The revelation left Nora speechless. Could Thomas, her Thomas, the humble schoolteacher, have been a disinherited heir to a fortune? "But why would someone want to take Emma?" she finally asked. "If what you say is true, wouldn't the Rutherfords want to find their grandchild? Unless someone else stands to inherit if Emma doesn't exist," Mason pointed out grimly. "Someone like your stepmother-in-law, perhaps." The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Catherine Rutherford, the young woman who had married Alina and Thomas's father, would inherit everything if there were no direct descendants. "We need proof," Nora said, her mind racing. "And we need to get to someone who can help us before Blackwood's men find us again." Mason nodded. "I've been thinking about that too. The closest telegraph office is in a mining town about a day's ride from here. I could send messages to the right people, get wheels turning, and leave Emma and me here alone." Nora couldn't keep the fear from her voice. Mason's hand found hers in the darkness. "I won't go unless you feel safe, but this might be our best chance to end this threat permanently." Nora's fingers tightened around his. "What if you don't come back?" In answer, Mason drew her closer, his free hand gently tilting her face upward. The kiss, when it came, was tender but filled with promise of return, of protection. of feelings neither had expected to find in the midst of danger. When they parted, Nora saw in Mason's eyes the same wonder she felt. This was not part of their plan, this connection that had grown between them like wildflowers after spring rain, unexpected but somehow perfectly right. "I will come back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just for Emma now, for you, for this." The next morning, they finalized plans for Mason's journey. He would ride to the mining town, send telegrams to contacts who could investigate the Rutherford connection, and return within 3 days. Nora would remain at the cabin with Emma, the doors barred and weapons ready. Before he left, Mason held Emma, now smiling and cooing at the man who had risked his life to protect her. "Take care of your mama," he told the baby solemnly. "I'll be back before you know it." To Nora, his goodbye was wordless, a lingering kiss, and an embrace that conveyed all they weren't yet ready to say aloud. The hours after Mason's departure stretched endlessly. Nora kept herself busy with chores and caring for Emma, but her eyes constantly strayed to the trail leading to the cabin. The second day brought a summer storm, rain lashing against the windows as thunder echoed through the mountains. On the morning of the third day, as Nora changed Emma's clothes, she noticed the birthmark behind her ear, the small crescent that had apparently set these events in motion. Such a tiny thing to cause so much upheaval. "Your papa had secrets," she told Emma softly, "but he loved us, and whatever happens, you'll always know where you came from, I promise you that." By midday, the sun had emerged, drying the muddy trail. Nora stepped onto the porch, scanning the horizon for any sign of Mason. Instead, what she saw made her blood run cold. 4 riders approaching slowly from the east, too deliberate to be casual travelers. Heart pounding, she retreated inside, barred the door, and gathered Emma and the rifle. The cabin's sturdy walls would provide some protection, but she was outnumbered and alone. As the riders drew closer, Nora positioned herself at a window, Emma secured in a basket behind the stone fireplace where stray bullets couldn't reach her. Her hands were steady on the rifle as she took aim at the lead rider. "That's far enough," she called out when they were within earshot. "I'm armed and I won't hesitate to shoot." The men halted, conferring briefly before one dismounted and stepped forward, hands raised to show he was unarmed. "Mrs. Nelson," he called. "My name is James Porter. I'm a detective with Pinkerton's National Detective Agency. We're not here to harm you or your child." Nora kept the rifle trained on him. "Prove it." The man reached slowly into his coat and withdrew an identification card and a folded paper. "I have a letter here from Alina Rutherford. She's been searching for her brother, your late husband, for years." Suspicion warred with hope in Nora's mind. "Leave it on the ground and back away." The detective complied, retreating to where his companions waited. Keeping the rifle ready, Nora opened the door just enough to retrieve the papers, then quickly barred it again. The identification appeared genuine, but it was the letter that captured her attention. Written in an elegant feminine hand, it addressed her directly. "Dear Mrs. Nelson, you do not know me, but I believe you were married to my beloved brother, Thomas Rutherford, who may have been using the name Thomas Nelson. If this is true, then your daughter Emma is my niece and the rightful heir to our family's estate. I have been searching for Thomas since he left Philadelphia 7 years ago after a terrible misunderstanding with our father. When news reached me of a man matching his description who had married and died in Wyoming territory, I engaged the Pinkerton Agency to investigate. What I did not anticipate was that my stepmother, Catherine, would learn of this investigation and take drastic measures to eliminate any threat to her inheritance. I have only recently discovered her connection to the outlaw Fletcher Blackwood and the attempt to abduct your child. Please trust Detective Porter and his men. They are instructed to bring you safely to me in Denver, where I have taken rooms awaiting your arrival. Legal proceedings against Catherine are already underway. With deepest hope and regard, Alina Rutherford. Nora read the letter twice, weighing its authenticity against her instincts. It aligned with Mason's theory and explained the attempt to take Emma. But could she trust these men? As if in answer to her silent question, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. A lone rider appeared from the West Mason, returning as promised. The scene he encountered made him draw his revolver immediately, but Nora called out from the window before shots could be exchanged. "Mason, wait. They might be friends." The tension crackled as Mason assessed the situation, his gun still raised as he dismounted and approached cautiously. Detective Porter identified himself again and explained their presence. "We've been trying to reach Mrs. Nelson for weeks," Porter concluded. "Miss Rutherford is most anxious to meet her niece." Mason looked to Nora, a silent question in his eyes. "They have a letter," she told him. "It confirms what you suspected about Thomas. These men were sent by his sister to protect us, not harm us." Though skeptical, Mason read the letter and examined the detective's credentials. After a thorough questioning that satisfied his cautious nature, he finally relaxed slightly. "If you're who you say you are, you won't mind if I accompany Mrs. Nelson and Emma to this meeting in Denver," he said, making it clear this wasn't a request. Porter smiled. "Miss Rutherford specifically mentioned a protective cowboy in her instructions. Said to thank you for your service and to ensure your comfort on the journey." Mason's eyebrows rose in surprise. "And how would she know about me?" "Sheriff Haynes sent telegrams far and wide looking for information," Porter explained. "Word eventually reached Miss Rutherford about the incident in Centralia and your role in it." The journey to Denver took 4 days, during which Nora's vigilance never fully subsided despite the Pinkertons' protection. Mason remained constantly at her side, his presence a comfort as they left the wilderness for increasingly populated areas. Denver's Grand Hotel, where Alina Rutherford awaited them, was unlike anything Nora had experienced since leaving St. Louis. As they entered the opulent lobby, she felt acutely aware of her travel-worn appearance. A private parlor had been arranged for their meeting, and as the door opened, Nora found herself face-to-face with a woman whose resemblance to Thomas was startling. The same kind eyes, the same gentle smile though framed by feminine features and crowned with auburn hair arranged in the latest fashion. "Nora," Alina said, her voice breaking slightly, "and this must be Emma." Her gaze fell on the baby in Nora's arms and tears filled her eyes. "She has the Rutherford mark, just like Thomas." The emotional reunion that followed confirmed what the letter had suggested. Thomas had indeed been Thomas Rutherford, disinherited after refusing to marry a woman of his father's choosing. He had fled west, changing his name and starting anew, never telling even Nora of his true identity for fear that his father would find him and force him to return. "He wrote to me once, shortly after your marriage," Alina explained as they sat together, Emma contentedly exploring a silver rattle Alina had brought as a gift. "He spoke so highly of you, of the life you were building together. When father died 2 years ago, I tried to find him, to tell him he could come home, that his share of the inheritance awaited him. But my letters never reached him." "Catherine intercepted them," Mason guessed from where he stood near the window, his posture still vigilant despite their safer surroundings. Alina nodded grimly. "Yes, and when she discovered I had hired detectives, she engaged Blackwood to eliminate any threat to her position. What she didn't expect was that I had already changed my will to name any child of Thomas's as my heir should something happen to me." "What will happen to her now?" Nora asked. "She's been arrested for conspiracy," Alina replied. "The evidence against her is substantial, thanks in part to your Sheriff Haynes and Mr. O'Malley here." Mason acknowledged this with a slight nod, but his attention remained focused on Nora, gauging her reaction to these revelations about her late husband. "I wish Thomas had trusted me with the truth," Nora said softly. Alina reached across to take her hand. "He was protecting you in his way. Our father was a powerful man with a long reach. Thomas feared what might happen if his true identity became known. The irony that his secrecy had ultimately led to the very danger he'd sought to avoid wasn't lost on any of them. As the afternoon progressed, practical matters were discussed. As Thomas's widow and Emma's mother, Nora was entitled to a significant inheritance. Alina insisted they stay in Denver while legal matters were settled, offering her own home as residence. "And what about you, Mr. O'Malley?" Alina asked as servants brought tea. "The Pinkerton reports speak highly of your courage." I understand you essentially silenced an entire valley of outlaws to protect my niece. Mason shifted uncomfortably under the praise. I did what anyone would do. No, Nora contradicted gently. You did what very few would have done. You risked your life for strangers. Their eyes met across the room, communicating far more than words could express. Eleanor, observant and perceptive, noted the exchange with interest. Mr. O'Malley, I hope you'll consider staying in Denver while these matters are resolved, she said, as a personal favor to me. I would rest easier knowing Nora and Emma still had your protection, official threat or not. Though the invitation was framed as a request for his services, everyone in the room understood its true purpose to allow whatever was growing between Mason and Nora the time and space to develop naturally. I suppose my ranch can survive without me a while longer, Mason conceded, his eyes never leaving Nora's face. In the weeks that followed, Nora adjusted to her new circumstances with a grace that impressed Denver society. Eleanor's introduction opened doors that would have remained firmly closed to a schoolteacher's widow. But Nora remained unchanged at heart, devoted to Emma and increasingly to Mason, who kept his promise to stay nearby. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. Catherine, facing overwhelming evidence and abandoned by her co-conspirators, confessed in hopes of leniency. Fletcher Blackwood, captured in a Pinkerton operation, would never again threaten another family. Emma, thriving under the loving attention of her mother, honorary aunt, and increasingly devoted Mason, grew more delightful by the day. Her birthmark, once a target on her back, was now a proud symbol of her heritage. One evening, as autumn painted Denver's trees in gold and crimson, Mason and Nora walked through Eleanor's garden after Emma had been put to bed. The customary chaperone lingered discreetly out of earshot, a concession to propriety that Eleanor insisted upon despite her progressive views. "Have you decided what you'll do?" Mason asked as they paused beside a fountain. Now that everything's settled legally, Nora considered the question. She was now a wealthy woman with options she'd never imagined having. Eleanor had offered her a permanent home in Denver, and there had been social invitations suggesting that, as a young widow of means, she would not lack for suitors. "I've been thinking about that," she admitted. This life, she gestured toward the mansion behind them, it's beautiful, comfortable. Emma would have every advantage. Mason nodded, his expression carefully neutral. She would, but it's not the life I want for her, or for myself. Nora turned to face him fully. "I've seen what wealth without love did to the Rutherfords. Thomas fled it. Eleanor endured years of loneliness because of it." Hope flickered in Mason's eyes. "What kind of life do you want, Nora?" "One with purpose, with love. With someone who would face down outlaws for us without a second thought." She took a deep breath. "I want to go home, Mason, to Wyoming, to Centralia." "Your home in town?" he asked, taking a step closer. "No," she met his gaze steadily, "to a certain ranch outside town. If its owner would have us." The smile that transformed Mason's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Its owner has been hoping you'd say that since the moment he first saw you standing your ground against those outlaws." He took her hands in his touch gentle yet sure. "I love you, Nora. You and Emma both. I didn't expect it, wasn't looking for it, but there it is, plain as day." "I love you too," she whispered, the words both a revelation and a confirmation of what her heart had known for weeks. "It happened so fast, in such strange circumstances, that I hardly dared believe it was real." "It's real," he assured her, drawing her into his arms. "And if you'll have me, I'd like to make it official, to be a father to Emma, a husband to you. To build that quiet life we both want, far from Blackwoods and Rutherfords and all the rest." Their kiss, witnessed only by the stars and a discreetly approving chaperone, sealed a promise that had begun in danger but would continue in peace. Eleanor, though disappointed to lose her newfound family to Wyoming's distant territory, understood the decision. She provided a generous wedding gift, the deed to Mason's rented ranch, now expanded to include adjoining properties, and a trust for Emma that would ensure her education and future without tying her to societal expectations. The wedding took place in Denver, a small but elegant affair with Eleanor as matron of honor and Sheriff Haynes, who had traveled from Centralia for the occasion, standing with Mason. Emma, dressed in lace and satin, watched with solemn blue eyes as her mother married the man who had risked everything to protect them. When they returned to Centralia 2 weeks later, it was as a family. The town that had witnessed the beginning of their story welcomed them home with curiosity and warmth. The valley that had once echoed with gunfire now resonated with the sounds of life and renewal. Mason and Nora's ranch flourished under their joint care. The house expanded to accommodate their growing family. Emma soon joined by a brother, Thomas Mason O'Malley, whose birth 2 years later coincided with the completion of a new schoolhouse in Centralia funded by Alina Rutherford in memory of her brother. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work complete, Mason and Nora would often sit on their porch, watching the stars emerge over the valley that had seen both violence and redemption. "Do you ever wonder," Nora asked on one such evening, 5 years after their first meeting, "what would have happened if those outlaws hadn't come to Centralia that day?" Mason's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I try not to think about it. But I do know this." He turned to meet her gaze, his eyes reflecting the same love that had grown steadier with each passing season. "I would have found you somehow. Some things are just meant to be." As their lips met in the gathering darkness, Nora knew he was right. The valley that Mason had once silenced with his gun now sang with the voices of their children. The lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through hay, fields a symphony of the life they had built together from the ashes of danger and deception. The birthmark that Emma bore, once the source of so much trouble, had faded slightly with time but remained a reminder of her heritage, not just of the Rutherford fortune that awaited her should she ever choose to claim it, but of the courage of her mother who had stood against outlaws, and the love of the cowboy who had become her father in every way that mattered. In the end, it wasn't wealth or social position that defined their happiness, but the family they had forged through adversity. The valley that had once known only the echo of gunfire now knew the deeper, lasting silence of peace, a peace that Mason O'Malley had won not just with his gun, but with his heart.